Alright, so let's go ahead now and get started with the first part of this training kit, in which we'll be using XSI to create pretty much all of the assets that our character is going to need to be able to run through this game engine. So things like color maps, normal maps, depth maps, things like animation, these are what we're going to be focusing on building and creating for the first half of this training kit. Alright, now on this disk that you're currently watching, you should be able to find a lesson called Lesson 2 Start. Right? That's what we're going to be working on for this starting point. Now what I have in this scene is just a simple game model. Alright, this is something that I've built just using simple polygon modeling techniques. Now because this is an intermediate level training kit, we'll go ahead and presume with the assumption that you've already had a chance to look at most of XSI's modeling tools. So if you've not had a chance to really explore XSI's modeling tools extensively and you want to learn how to build a character such as this using XSI's modeling set, we actually do have an entire dedicated training kit to polygon and subdivision surface modeling in XSI. So if you've not had a chance to look extensively into XSI's modeling toolset, I would highly recommend picking that up. So once you have sort of a low resolution character such as this, what we could do now is begin to slowly add detail and more geometry and more depth to this character, and then eventually we could use that depth information and that detail to move back onto this low resolution piece of geometry. So normally what we could do is take this existing piece of geometry that we have, and what I'll do is switch to my move tool and just simply Control D to duplicate this piece of geometry. I'll move this one off and over to the side, just somewhere to where it's out of the way. And now what we have is a duplicate piece of geometry here that we can slowly now begin to add whatever amount of detail that we want. So for example, if we wanted to be able to add things like bevels or new pieces of geometry altogether, let's start with a bevel. Let's say around the top portion of this collar. So what I could do is just switch this to an edge selection mode, and then just Alt middle click to be able to select this entire loop. Right, now with this loop selected, let's go to Modify, Polymesh, and let's bevel components. There we are. So now I can control things like the distance for this bevel, how many subdivisions this bevel will actually have in it. There we are. So I'm going to do the same really quickly right along here. I'll just middle click on this button to be able to use the last command from the Polymesh menu. So we'll give this a couple more subdivisions, give it a decent amount of distance, and there we go. So now we have a little bit of a bevel that's already been included on here, so that way whenever we smooth this, it will help to maintain a little bit more of its definition and some more of its shape. So I'll go ahead and proceed with this. So normally what we would do is select this piece of geometry, go to Polymesh, and down to Local Subdivision Refinement. Alright, this will bring us into a picking session where we can now select this entire mesh and smooth all of these edges in one shot. So from here we can choose different subdivision levels, level 1, level 2, and so on and so forth. Now normally I would leave this at about level 1. Right, that should be pretty sufficient for anything that we need. And you can see now, because of these bevels, it's helped to maintain a little bit more of its shape. And we actually now have a pretty nice, clean looking bevel right along in through here. Right? And whenever we later on generate a normal map, that will translate really nicely back onto this low resolution geometry. Now one technique that I really like to use and that I find to be really useful for adding detail is to actually add detail on top of the existing geometry. So for example, things like ribs or external pieces of this suit, a lot of times what I like to do is use things like my polygon raycast selection. Right, so I'll use the U key on my keyboard. From there I'll select a handful of faces and now go to Polymesh, Extract Polygons, Keep. And you can see what that does is actually generates a new piece of geometry, basically rips off those faces for me. Right, just like so. So now what I can do is switch back to my polygon selection, select all of these polygons, and just simply Control D to duplicate these faces. Maybe scale this up just a little bit. Right, and you can see now we have this nice piece of geometry that conforms perfectly to this chess piece. So now all I would have to do is, with this piece of geometry selected, just once again go back to my local subdivision refinement, and now I can smooth this up. So I now have this piece of geometry, like I said, that conforms perfectly to this existing part of the body. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and go back to my Layers panel, and actually I'm going to go ahead and now turn on the visibility for a piece of high-resolution geometry that I've already completed this entire process on. Right, so this is the exact same techniques, just smoothed out my low-resolution model, extracted a few pieces for external detail, extracted a few pieces around this central chest area to then build up and add this neat little ventilation system that's on the front part of this, extracted out faces for areas around the shoulder, extruded in a few faces for some of these ridges around the arms, all just pretty basic techniques for adding a little bit of detail. You know, splitting some faces down around the leg and extruding those. Like I said, all just pretty simple techniques, but that do a pretty good job of adding just the amount of detail that we need onto this character. So what we have now at this point are pretty much two characters. One that's this very high resolution character, and if you turn on the visibility, we now have this secondary character that we originally started out with that had the low resolution geometry. Right, now occasionally there may be circumstances where you actually start with a high resolution piece of geometry, but maybe then you want to go back down. If that's the case, there is actually a bonus lesson at the end of this training kit talking about XSI's polygon reduction tools. So if you ever come across a situation where you have a high-resolution piece of geometry that you now want to be able to down-res, be sure to check out that bonus lesson that, like I said, is included on this disc. Alright, so we have this high-resolution model and the low-resolution model. So what we need to do now through the course of the next several lessons is begin the process of now transferring this detail and this data from the high-res mesh down onto your low-res mesh. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and begin that process in the next lesson.